Beijing is stealing the South China Sea. For centuries, these waters have been threatened by bloodshed and disagreements. And in 2013, the Chinese government dispatched enormous ships to rip up the seafloor and create artificial islands where military complexes would eventually be built. This would only turn out to be the first stage in the evolution of Beijing's power grab in the South China Sea. But now, what China saw as a clever solution to snatch control of this important waterway may end up being a disaster for them. The artificial islands where massive runways, anti-ship guns, and cruise missiles are located are now beginning to sink back into the ocean. So how did Beijing make such costly miscalculations in its plans to secure the South China Sea? What is causing the islands to sink? And is there anything China can do to save its military bases from falling in the ocean? In 2013, Chinese ships began dredging coral reefs, teeming with life in the eastern part of the South China Sea. This was done to strengthen China's position over contested waters in the region. By building 7 artificial islands with a cumulative area of around 3,000 acres near the Spratly Islands between Vietnam and the Philippines, China was able to secure resources and control waterways in the area. The reefs and seafloor were pulverized to generate the materials needed to create the artificial islands and the military structures that were built atop them. And this meant moving up enormous amounts of material. In fact, it is estimated that just one Chinese dredger, the Tianjin, shifted 4,500 cubic meters of materials on its own every hour. That's enough to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools with crushed coral, sand, and rocks. But why did China engage in such damaging, destructive practices? What is so important about the South China Sea? There are actually several reasons why China so badly wants to control the area, and they can all be grouped into one of 3 categories. First is the South China Sea's economic importance. It is estimated that 1/3 of total global shipping passes through the South China Sea. That's right. Every time you buy something off Amazon that's made in China or another South Asian country, there's a good chance it's passing through the South China Sea on the way to your house. And that's a huge amount of money. Approximately $5.3 trillion worth of goods and resources are transported through these waters each year. What makes the waterway so lucrative is that it's the main route ships pass through to cross between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And this passage is only getting more important as trade between Africa and China is growing every year. China knows that whoever controls this part of the world also controls the economies, and therefore the governments that rely on the South China Sea to move goods. The cargo flowing through the Strait of Malacca and into the South China Sea mostly consists of oil, minerals, metals, food, and manufactured goods. In total, more than 60% of global trade passes through Asia, and although not all of it goes through the South China Sea, a big percentage does. China knows that if it lost control of this waterway in a conflict, it would be a huge blow to its economy and power. By controlling the South China Sea, Beijing can ensure that its economic output remains unhindered and resources will continue to flow into its borders. Then there's the second reason China so desperately wants to control this body of water that it's built artificial islands there, and that's the military advantage it gives them. On top of the economic importance of its waters, strategic importance is also a key factor in Beijing's decision to rip up the seafloor and build military facilities. For decades, Manila and Beijing have butted heads over who controls the South China Sea, and when international courts do occasionally rule against Chinese expansionist tendencies, Beijing simply ignores them. China has been militarizing the South China Sea by deploying more and more naval ships there, but also by taking things a step further and building entire military installations on their man-made islands, islands which sit less than 200 miles from the Philippine island of Palawan. In an armed conflict, Beijing would need unfettered access to the South China Sea in order to move its forces to counteract any aggression. And what China is really preparing for is a conflict with the United States. Tensions have risen over China's aggressive stance on incorporating Taiwan into its borders. And although the island nation isn't entirely in the South China Sea, Beijing would still need to control the region to move naval ships and forces to key locations. The artificial islands would also provide a huge strategic advantage since China could more closely monitor and dispatch forces to intercept vessels entering the region through the Strait of Malacca. The artificial islands and the military bases on them could also serve as fortresses in the region that act as formidable defenses if China found itself at odds with another power. In addition to the economic and military advantages of controlling the South China Sea, there's also its own abundant natural resources. Its waters are filled with nutrients due to upwelling, a process where cold, nutrient-rich water from the ocean's depths rise to the surface, and other hydrological processes in this part of the ocean. Countries in the area, such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, rely heavily on its bountiful waters to feed their populations. Unsurprisingly, China also acquires vast amounts of fish from the South China Sea. Beijing has used its artificial islands there as a way to extend its claims to the resources in the region, including fishing territories. This has led to international backlash, as much of the South China Sea is supposed to be considered a free movement zone, since a nation's territory only extends 12 nautical miles from its shores. The 12 nautical mile limit is based on the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which stipulates that a nation's territorial waters can extend up to 12 nautical miles from its coastline. Beyond this limit, waters are supposed to be considered international territory, ensuring freedom of navigation for all countries. The South China Sea has abundant amounts of tuna, mackerel, anchovy, shrimp, and numerous other species. Beijing knows that the more control it has over the food stocks in the region, the more power it wields. On top of that, China needs to ensure that its enormous population has access to food as well. It's estimated that China consumes around 65 million tons of seafood per year. To put this into perspective, the United States consumes around 7 million tons of seafood per year, meaning that China needs almost 10 times as much seafood. Seafood, of course, comes from all over the world, but the South China Sea makes up a large chunk of the overall procurement of seafood for the country. In fact, 12% of all seafood caught globally is estimated to come from the South China Sea. And as China is the largest seller of fish in the world, it needs to make sure that it always has access to the waters of the South China Sea. China is responsible for close to 20% of the world's total marine catch, which is 3 times more than the next largest fish-procuring country, Indonesia. The fishing industry in China generated over $20 billion in exports a decade ago, while the fishing retail market within China reached $75 billion in 2021. It is worth mentioning that at current rates, fishing stocks could be virtually depleted by the end of the century, so controlling the South China Sea might only be a relatively short-term benefit when it comes to food production. But there's a much more lucrative resource sitting under the waters of the South China Sea: oil. China is the second largest consumer of oil on the planet, second only to the United States. The country uses around 14.3 million barrels of oil a day, and the United States Energy Information Administration estimates that there are around 11 billion barrels of oil in the South China Sea, along with 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Not only would these fossil fuel stores provide a steady flow of energy resources to China, but it would be a very lucrative export as well. There are many advantages to being the dominant power in the South China Sea, which is why Beijing has built artificial islands to protect its interests and assert control, even if what they are doing goes against international laws. But what China cannot ignore is the ocean itself. And as they are finding out now, the South China Sea is not making their power grab of the region easy, as the weather, water, and geology of the area have all started playing a prominent role in sinking the islands that China just recently finished constructing. The South China Sea itself was created around 60 million years ago as a result of tectonic activity, including rifting and seafloor spreading. It encompasses an area of around 1,423,000 square miles and has an average depth of 3,976 feet. The deepest section is called the China Sea Basin and is 16,457 feet deep. Given these depths, it's clear why China hasn't attempted to build islands there. The sheer logistics and resources required would be astronomical. So where and how did China establish its artificial islands? Constructing such land masses isn't just an engineering feat, but also an ecologically impactful activity, and the methods China employed, as we'll delve into, were particularly damaging. Whole habitats were obliterated, marine life perished, and the repercussions for the regional ecosystem could linger for generations. The first thing China had to do was decide where to build its artificial islands. They needed to be a relatively shallow area with access to resources such as reefs, sand, and rocks. They also needed to consider the strategic significance and the location of natural resources they wanted access to, which is why it was decided to build near the Spratly Islands, a sprawling archipelago of over 100 small islands, atolls, and reefs that are around 620 miles from mainland China, to gather the resources necessary to build the foundation of the islands. Huge fleets of ships over 300 feet in length dredged the seafloor. The dredged materials were then suctioned from the seabed, channeled through pipes and hoses, and deposited onto the chosen sites of the islands. Huge mounds of coarse sand and crushed rocks made up the foundation of the islands, and once they were the right size, the Chinese government brought in cargo ships full of materials and construction equipment to build the military structures on top of the newly formed land masses. During this process, not only was the marine ecosystem obliterated to create the new materials to create the islands, but huge plumes of waste covered any remaining reefs in the area, suffocating them to death. Billions and billions of aquatic creatures died as a result of the island building process. The Chinese construction companies also needed to carry out what is called concreting, which was clearly not done properly, as this is now one of the key factors that is causing the artificial islands to fall apart. Ideally, once the foundation was laid, rods should have been driven into the seabed to support boundary rocks, which would protect the island from the wind and wave erosion. This should also have been supplemented by concrete retaining walls around the island for extra protection. It appears this process was done on some of the artificial islands, but on others it was completed in a haphazard fashion, if at all. As the sides of the islands are now collapsing back into the sea, and China now has to worry about further reinforcing their structures if they plan to keep the islands functional for longer than a few years. But poor construction planning is only the tip of the iceberg that China is going to have to contend with if they're going to keep their man-made islands above water. Their first big challenge is something that not even China's huge amount of wealth or manpower can change, and that's the weather. It's estimated that the South China Sea could see as many as 18 typhoons per year as climate change causes the intensity and frequency of storms to increase. Typhoons are actually the same natural phenomena as hurricanes. The only difference is where the storm is located, with hurricanes forming in the Atlantic and Northeast Pacific, and typhoons in the Northwestern Pacific. Both hurricanes and typhoons are tropical cyclones, though, that consist of a rotating low-pressure weather system that has sustained thunderstorms but no fronts. The storm must have sustained surface wind of no less than 74 miles per hour to be considered a hurricane or typhoon. Due to their location, China's artificial islands are undoubtedly going to be hit by intense storms pretty frequently that bring with them huge waves and powerful winds, which means the erosion of the sides of the island can happen rather quickly. Weather patterns tend to move from east to west in the region, which at least means that the islands are somewhat protected by the Philippines. Even with that small amount of natural protection, though, it would be advantageous to build strong breakers and durable structures for precautionary purposes. But no amount of protection would help if a super typhoon swept across the region and the islands were built hastily and without much attention to detail. And unfortunately, that seems to be exactly what happened across the region, and the islands were built hastily, and without much in the way of quality control. Beijing's mission was to build artificial islands in the South China Sea as quickly and as cheaply as possible. In order to do this, very few regulations or oversight were implemented in the construction phases of both the islands themselves and the structures atop them. The result of poor workmanship and cheap materials is that the man-made islands are already starting to fall apart. It has only been 8 years since most of the islands were completed, and the fact that they are already crumbling does not bode well for their long-term future. There were a couple of major problems with the building process. The first was that although the islands themselves were made from dredged-up sediments from the bottom of the sea, the protective structures, such as the concrete and rock walls surrounding the islands, needed to be made using imported materials. To keep costs down, it appears highly likely that Beijing utilized concrete and building materials that were of low quality and could be cheaply mass-produced. This might not have been such a big problem if the islands were right off the mainland. But the very nature of an island in the South China Sea means that it is isolated and constantly bombarded by waves and storms. Building materials that could survive for decades near the shore will only last a few years in the middle of the sea, as China is now finding out. The other problem is that the artificial islands were built by Chinese companies that had no experience in the world of island construction. China doesn't like to outsource construction projects since that is something that they themselves specialize in. However, it probably would have been beneficial in this case to bring in outside firms who have experience in island creation to ensure that the artificial landmasses being built would withstand prolonged exposure to the elements in the South China Sea. This presumably wasn't the case, and now the ocean is eating away at both of the islands and the military installations on top of them. But even if they had taken all the right steps, using high-quality materials and hiring experts in the field to oversee construction, there's still another big problem: rising sea levels. As global temperatures rise as a result of climate change, so too do sea levels. This is because ice, snow, and glaciers around the planet are melting and pouring water into the oceans. And it looks certain that the sea levels are only going to continue to rise in the years to come. Which is why the populations of many inhabited islands across the world are creating contingency plans to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Sea levels rise about 0.13 inches per year. This might not seem like much, but over time, the rising sea levels of the oceans will cause massive amounts of flooding all across the planet. And this includes the artificial islands that China has built. For islands that only sit a few feet above sea level, the oceans could literally swallow them up by the end of the century. Earlier predictions by scientists suggested that if we could reduce the amount of greenhouse gases being put into the atmosphere and slow the warming of the planet, then sea levels would rise around 2 feet by 2021. However, most of the countries, including the United States and China, that set goals to reduce their current greenhouse emissions have failed to reach them. This means that global warming will likely increase at an even faster rate, which will result in sea levels rising much more rapidly than previously predicted. Revised estimates now put the sea level rise at around 3.2 feet by the end of the 21st century, meaning that hundreds of islands around the globe will be underwater. Countries like Maldives will disappear entirely, and cities near the coast like New York will experience such intense flooding that people will need to shift from using subways to get around to hopping on boats. And China's artificial islands are no exception. Rising water levels are going to continue to degrade the integrity of these islands every year. The already crumbling shorelines will rapidly deteriorate, compromising the integrity of roads, runways, and structures on the island. While the Chinese government scrambles to solve these problems, it will have to pour more financial resources and manpower into the project. It is not out of the realm of possibility that the Chinese defenses in the South China Sea will be destroyed not by a foreign nation, but by Mother Nature herself. But Mother Nature might not be finished exacting her revenge on the islands just yet, as China's aggression and hunger to create artificial islands to fortify their position in the South China Sea may actually lead to their downfall, even before the seas rise to engulf them. You see, all of those reefs, sandbars, mangroves, and other naturally occurring aquatic ecosystems that China destroyed in the construction of the islands create barriers that slow the movement of waves and protect shorelines. By destroying massive amounts of coral reefs and dredging the sea floor around the islands, China may have compromised the natural barriers that would have protected their military bases from the elements. Scientists have discovered that coral reefs can substantially reduce coastal flooding and erosion. They can decrease wave energy by an astonishing 97% in some cases. Therefore, the reefs that now serve as the foundation of the artificial islands in the South China Sea would have protected the area from strong storms and waves, So China's island-building process may actually be one of the main contributors to the recent problems they've run into with the sinking of their man-made islands. But it's not all gloom and doom for China. There are actually some steps they could take to mitigate the sinking of the islands. But before we get into the possible solutions, let's get a better idea of where we are today and what exactly is on the man-made islands in the South China Sea. In 1947, China made its first official claim to the South China Sea following the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. At the time, China was under the rule of the nationalist Kuomintang Party, and they put forth a claim by introducing the 11-dash line, a demarcation line on a map which encircled the majority of the South China Sea, suggesting that everything within this line was China's territory. This line essentially became a graphical assertion of China's claim over almost the entire South China Sea, covering a vast expanse and numerous island groups. As a result of this claim, the Pratas Islands, the Macclesfield Bank, and the Paracel and Spartley Islands were all considered as belonging to China. However, in 1949, when communist leader Mao Zedong came to power, huge reforms were enacted. By 1953, the Chinese Communist Party revised some of its older claims and modified the map's line to have only 9 dashes, effectively removing the Gulf of Tonkin off the east coast of Vietnam from its territorial claims. The new 9-dash line set a historical precedent for China's territorial ambitions, and in fact, the 9-dash line is still used by Beijing today to justify its actions in the South China Sea. For the next several decades, tensions between Vietnam and China remained high as both sides fought over territory in the South China Sea. In 1988, the Chinese Navy sank 3 Vietnamese ships, killing 74 people. It was during this time that China became more assertive and dominant in the region, and soon both sides began to occupy different reefs in the South China Sea in order to monitor the actions of the other. Then, in 1992, China passed the Law on the Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone. This declaration by China stated that it had the right to claim the entirety of the South China Sea as its own territory, due to the historical control of the region by the Jia dynasty between the 21st and 16th centuries, BCE. That's right, it was based on borders that were roughly 4,000 years old and was mainly done to prevent the United States and the Soviet Union from passing an agreement to allow freedom of navigation for warships through the area. In 2009, Malaysia and Vietnam filed a joint submission to the United Nations to allow them to access the continental shelves beyond their agreed-upon coastal borders. However, China saw this as a move by other nations to encroach on their territory in the South China Sea. It was at this point that the United States entered the discussion and advocated for open access to Asia's maritime commons. This was one of the last things that China wanted as it desperately tried to keep the US and its allies at arm's length. In November 2013, China's Ministry of Defense announced the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone that required all non-commercial aircraft to submit flight plans prior to entering the area. This zone did not include the South China Sea, but that was because Beijing had other plans at the time. The following month, it was discovered that Chinese ships had begun dredging near the Spartley Islands, where they would eventually build their artificial islands with military bases atop them over the next 2 years. In October of 2015, a United States Navy patrol ship passed within 12 nautical miles of one of the islands under the pretense of freedom of navigation. Upon gathering more information, U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter urged Beijing to stop its building projects in the region, expressing concern over the militarization of the South China Sea. In 2016, reports came out that Beijing had deployed surface-to-air missiles on Woody Island in the Parcel Island chain in the South China Sea. The United States claimed this act further militarized the South China Sea, but Beijing responded that the missiles fell under their defensive rights. On May 18, 2018, the first Chinese bomber landed on Woody Island, a Xi'an H-6. This bomber could reach any target around the South China Sea, including the Philippines, which led to tensions in the region, rising even higher. For the next several years, China continued to expand its military presence in the South China Sea. And today, there are sophisticated radar equipment and large cannons on several of the artificial islands, along with long runways that can support large numbers of aircraft. In October of 2022, a photographer by the name of Ezra Akayan was able to secure a ride aboard a flight that passed China's artificial islands, and he took a number of pictures that helped analysts identify what the Chinese had actually built. It was discovered that the islands had naval gun emplacements, large radar domes, and hangar facilities that could be housing aircraft. The extent to which these islands have been developed in such a short time was both alarming and astonishing to observers. However, this adds credence to the theory that the defenses and the actual island construction itself were likely rushed, which is why they are now beginning to lose their structural integrity and erode away. That being said, some of the islands are still well prepared for conflict. They have long runways that are capable of landing most types of transports, fighters, and bombers. There are also a number of Navy vessels docked at the island. Most notable are the Type O-22 Haobei-class catamaran fast attack missile craft, which can carry up to 8 YJ-83 subsonic anti-ship missiles. Guns defending the island, including Type 730-1130 close-in weapon systems and HPJ 76mm multi-purpose deck guns, which would be able to protect the islands from low-flying aircraft, cruise missiles, and drones in the event of an attack. So it appears that China has achieved its goal of spreading its influence and ramping up its defenses across the South China Sea to protect its interests and prepare for any opposition that it might come across. Of course, all that investment in military might doesn't mean much if your island sinks into the sea. There are ways to keep the man-made islands from being reclaimed by the sea, but it would cost a lot of money and resources. But it's unclear if China is willing to pour more time, men, and effort into these islands, or if they will just use them until the structures collapse into the ocean. To be fair, the erosion of the islands will take time. However, the combined threat of more intense storms due to climate change, rising sea levels, and constant waves crashing against the shores may be enough to cause serious damage to the islands in the coming years. Then there's the fact that this is only a matter of time before the South China Sea experiences another super typhoon. The last super typhoon, called Typhoon Haiyan, or Super Typhoon Yolanda, as it's known in the Philippines, occurred between November 3, 2013 and November 11, 2013, and it was one of the most intense and powerful cyclones ever recorded. The typhoon caused 6,352 casualties, left 1,771 people missing, and did $2.98 billion in damage. Haiyan had 10-minute sustained winds clocked at 145 miles per hour and 1-minute sustained winds of 195 miles per hour. These speeds are enough to knock down trees all on their own and cause serious damage to buildings. And this super typhoon passed right by the patch of open ocean where China has now built its artificial islands. It's not that hard to imagine another super typhoon plowing through the region while Beijing can do nothing but helplessly watch as its artificial islands are destroyed, wiping out the radar stations and structures that China has just recently built. Even with the evacuation plans in place to save the lives of the people on them, with sustained winds over 100 miles per hour and waves hitting the islands with the force of a Mack truck, there would be very little hope that China's military assets would survive unscathed. In fact, during Super Typhoon Haiyan, it was reported that 11.10 inches of rain fell in under 12 hours. There were also storm surges where waves measured 16 to 20 feet high. And since many of the reefs around China's artificial islands were destroyed, the waves from a super typhoon in the area today could end up being even bigger. At this point, it appears that there is very little that China can realistically do to improve its situation. And with each year that passes, the chances of a powerful storm slamming into the islands becomes more and more likely. This is especially true as weather systems become more powerful and frequent as global temperatures rise. Simply put, it may be too late for China's man-made islands. Since there appears to be no real effort to fix the already sinking pieces of land, it's unlikely that they will be prepared for a massive storm in the coming years. However, until this happens, the military bases on the islands seem to be operational, and China has at least achieved some of its short-term goals.